the quiet neighborhood of Covington, Georgia, the morning sun cast a warm glow over the Jackson household. It was one of those mornings where the world felt perfectly in order, a time when neighbors exchanged polite waves, dogs barked cheerfully in backyards, and the aroma of coffee filled the air. Inside their modest but welcoming home, Shakeema Brown Jackson was already dressed in her sheriff's deputy uniform, the neatly pressed shirt reflecting her pride in her work. Her smile, known to brighten the toughest of days, lingered as she poured orange juice into her son Cameron's cup. The 6-year-old sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs as he tried to finish his breakfast and his latest drawing of a fire truck. "Come on, Cam. Let's see if we can't finish that toast before we leave," Shakeema said warmly, her tone gentle but firm, the voice of a mother who balanced love and discipline with grace. Across the room, Jaquavia, her husband, flipped through his tablet, sipping his coffee. He looked up with a reassuring smile, one that might have seemed effortless to anyone watching. But Shakeema caught a fleeting hint of distraction in his expression. She chose not to press him, chalking it up to work stress. After all, Jaquavia's job as a logistics manager often came with long hours and tight deadlines. Their life together wasn't extraordinary by any stretch, but it was steady, a comforting rhythm that Shakeema cherished. Her brother Levoy visited often, his booming laugh filling the house whenever he dropped by. The bond between them was unshakable, built on years of shared memories and mutual support. Levoy adored his nephew, always coming over with a new book or toy in hand, jokingly complaining about spoiling Cameron too much. The Jacksons were a family admired by their community. Shakeema's dedication to her role in law enforcement had earned her the respect of neighbors and colleagues alike, while Jaquavia's personable charm made him a fixture at local events. They were the kind of couple you'd see at the front of a charity run, holding hands, their son perched on Jaquavia's shoulders, cheering on the crowd. But on this particular morning, something hung faintly in the air, an unease so subtle it was almost imperceptible. Shakeema felt it in the pauses between conversations, in the slight stiffness of Jaquavia's hugs, and in the way Levoy's jokes seemed to land with a little less ease. Still, life had a way of nudging those thoughts aside. Routine beckoned, and Shakeema had a busy day ahead. She kissed her son on the forehead, grabbed her keys, and promised Jaquavia she'd be home in time for dinner. As the garage door rolled down and Shakeema drove off to start her shift, everything about the Jackson family's morning seemed perfectly ordinary. Neighbors smiled as Cameron played outside under Levoy's watchful eye, and Jaquavia headed off to work with his tablet in hand. What do you think makes a picture-perfect family? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're as intrigued as we are, hit that like button to dive deeper into this chilling story. It was a typical Tuesday morning when Shakeema found herself pulled into what would later be recognized as a career milestone. A routine traffic stop had taken an unexpected turn when she uncovered a significant theft operation linked to the driver. Her quick thinking and sharp instincts earned her praise from her department and a small feature in the local news. For a brief moment, Shakeema allowed herself to feel proud of her dedication, her work, and the example she set for her son. But pride, as fleeting as it was, didn't prepare her for what awaited later that evening. At home, dinner had just been cleared away, and Cameron was playing with his toy cars on the living room floor. Shakeema was sorting through the day's mail when an envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to Jaquavia, but her name was scrawled on a sticky note attached to the front, asking her to review its contents. The sender, a law firm she didn't recognize. She opened it cautiously, her pulse quickening with every word. Inside was a subpoena, an official request for Jaquavia to appear in court over a paternity claim. For a moment, the words blurred together. The idea that this could even be real felt absurd. She closed the envelope and sat still, listening to Cameron's soft hums as he played, trying to steady herself. When Jaquavia walked through the door a few minutes later, Shakeema greeted him calmly, her usual warmth replaced by measured composure. "We need to talk," she said, holding up the envelope. His eyes flickered to it briefly before he exhaled and took a seat across from her. "This," he said, holding the subpoena. "It's nonsense, Shakeema. Someone's just trying to stir up trouble. You know people will do anything for money these days." His tone was light, almost dismissive, as though he didn't believe the matter deserved more than a passing comment. But Shakeema wasn't convinced. "Nonsense or not, it's a legal summons. You have to go to court, Jaquavia." "What's this about?" Her voice remained even, but there was an edge in her gaze, a quiet insistence that this conversation wasn't over. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "It's nothing serious. I'll handle it. I promise." He reached for her hand across the table, but she hesitated. His casual demeanor only added to the unease gnawing at her. Jaquavia had always been good with words, but this time she noticed how carefully he chose them. Over the following days, Shakeema tried to brush off her doubts, but small, almost imperceptible cracks in their life together began to surface. Jaquavia started taking calls in another room, lowering his voice to a murmur. His already long workday seemed to stretch even further, and his excuses for coming home late were just plausible enough not to question outright. Her brother, Levoy, sensed her unease during one of his visits. "You good, sis?" he asked, casually leaning against the kitchen counter. Shakeema shrugged, not wanting to burden him with her growing worries. "Just tired from work," she said, offering a quick smile. Levoy didn't press further, but his expression lingered with concern. One evening, while Jaquavia was out working late, Shakeema noticed his tablet left unlocked on the couch. She hesitated, her instincts as a law enforcement officer clashing with her role as a wife. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, won. She opened his email app and scrolled, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Yet her hands didn't stop trembling. The real question wasn't what she found, but why she felt compelled to look in the first place. By the time Jaquavia returned home that night, the house was quiet. Shakeema sat in their bedroom, staring at the subpoena still resting on her nightstand. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the man she married was the person she thought she knew. But for the first time in years, uncertainty had planted itself in her mind, refusing to leave. The cracks in their seemingly perfect life were small, but they were there. And once noticed, they were impossible to ignore. Would you trust your partner if faced with this kind of situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. The courthouse felt cold, indifferent. Shakeema sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together, her face a picture of calm determination that betrayed none of the storm raging within her. To anyone watching, she seemed unshaken, but inside, her thoughts tumbled over one another in an unrelenting loop. She glanced sideways at Jaquavia, who sat rigidly beside her, avoiding her gaze. The hearing began without fanfare. The plaintiff's attorney introduced Alexis, a young woman who, by her posture alone, seemed equally eager and reluctant to be there. The lawyer's voice droned on, presenting a litany of evidence that landed like hammer blows: years of text messages, photos of Jaquavia attending birthday parties Shakeema had never heard of, and a meticulously detailed record of financial transactions. Payments labeled as child support and receipts for school supplies were laid out for all to see. Then came the photos, images of two children who bore an undeniable resemblance to Jaquavia. Shakeema froze, her chest tightening. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The children's smiles were innocent, unknowing, and yet they shattered her in a way she hadn't thought possible. Every detail was undeniable, every piece of evidence another crack in the life she thought she knew. Jaquavia sat motionless beside her, his face carefully neutral, as though he were a spectator rather than the man at the center of it all. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he finally spoke, his voice steady but void of genuine remorse. "Your Honor, I never denied helping out someone in need, but this situation has been exaggerated. I don't even know if those kids are mine." The statement was met with murmurs in the courtroom, but Shakeema heard nothing else. Her ears buzzed, and the air felt thick and stifling. The judge ordered a DNA test to confirm paternity, but by then, the damage was already done. Shakeema stood abruptly when the session ended, her legs trembling beneath her. She walked out of the courtroom without a word, Jaquavia trailing behind her. The ride home was unbearably silent. Shakeema gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she fought to keep herself from breaking down. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to remain composed even in the most chaotic situations. But this wasn't a routine traffic stop or a dangerous call. This was her life unraveling in real time. When they got home, Shakeema didn't wait. As soon as the door closed behind them, she turned to Jaquavia, her voice low and steady, a tone far more dangerous than if she had screamed. "Tell me the truth, all of it." Now, Jaquavia sighed, running a hand over his face as though he were the one carrying the weight of betrayal. "Shakeema, it's complicated," she interrupted, her voice rising. "You have 2 kids with another woman, Jaquavia. You've been lying to me for years. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" "I never meant for this to happen," he said, his voice defensive now. "You don't understand. It was a mistake. It's not like I don't love you." "Stop." Shakeema's voice cracked, her composure slipping. "Don't you dare tell me you love me after what you've done. Love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't feel like this." The argument escalated quickly, each word slicing through the fragile remnants of their relationship. The sound of their raised voices echoed through the house, sharp and raw. It was during this chaotic moment that Levoy walked in, his presence as solid and grounding as ever. "What's going on?" Levoy's voice was calm but firm, his eyes scanning the scene. He didn't need an explanation. The tension in the room told him everything he needed to know. "He's been lying to me," Shakeema said, her voice breaking. "He has 2 kids with another woman, Levoy." "2." Levoy's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he turned to Jaquavia. "You've got some nerve," he said coldly. "All this time, pretending like you had it all together while dragging my sister through this mess." Jaquavia, already defensive, snapped back. "This is between me and Shakeema. Stay out of it." "That's where you're wrong," Levoy shot back. "You don't get to do this to her and expect me to stay quiet." The tension between the 2 men crackled, threatening to spill over. Shakeema, caught in the middle, tried to hold herself together, but the weight of the betrayal was too much. She turned away, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. Meanwhile, Cameron, awakened by the commotion, peeked out from his bedroom door, his wide eyes taking in the scene. Shakeema noticed him instantly, her heart breaking all over again. "Go back to bed, baby," she said gently, forcing a smile. But the damage was already done. As the argument continued, voices rising and overlapping, the night outside grew darker. Neighbors later recalled hearing angry voices, then nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, almost unnatural. And in that silence, the Jackson household, once a symbol of stability and love, stood as a quiet reminder of how quickly everything can change. As the night deepens, the household becomes eerily silent. What would you do if you were in Shakeema's shoes? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this gripping tale. The stillness of the night was shattered by the sound of sirens piercing the quiet streets of Covington. A neighbor, alarmed by the sudden silence following the earlier argument, had called 911 after hearing what they described as loud bangs coming from the Jackson home. Police arrived swiftly, their vehicles flooding the neighborhood with red and blue lights, casting ominous shadows across the well-kept lawns. Inside the Jackson home, the scene was horrific. Shakeema lay motionless on the living room floor, multiple gunshot wounds visible on her body. Nearby, Levoy was slumped against the wall, his blood pooling beneath him. The air was thick with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the suffocating weight of death. Officers moved cautiously, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. Cameron, trembling and clutching his favorite toy, was found hiding in a closet, too terrified to speak. Jaquavia met the officers at the door, his demeanor frantic but oddly composed. He claimed that intruders had broken in, targeting his family in what he described as a random, senseless act of violence. "I tried to stop them," he said, his voice shaking just enough to sound convincing. "But they were armed. They killed my wife and brother-in-law before I could do anything." The officers listened but exchanged subtle glances. Something about his story felt off. Jaquavia's clothes were suspiciously clean for someone who had allegedly fought off armed intruders, and his hands bore faint traces of soot-like marks that seasoned officers recognized instantly. Despite his attempts at appearing distraught, his behavior felt rehearsed, as though he were playing a role in his own alibi. Detectives arrived shortly after, quickly taking over the investigation. They meticulously combed through the house, documenting every detail. The initial observations painted a troubling picture. There were no signs of forced entry, no valuables missing, and the positions of the bodies suggested a confrontation far more personal than a random burglary. Forensic experts worked through the night, their findings raising more questions than answers. Gunshot residue tests revealed traces on Jaquavia's hands, an alarming discovery given his insistence that he had no part in the violence. Ballistic analysis confirmed that the weapon used was a handgun registered in Shakeema's name, one that was later found tucked hastily beneath a couch cushion. Interviews with neighbors further complicated Jaquavia's story. Several reported hearing the argument earlier that evening, describing the shouting and tension as louder and more volatile than usual. Some even mentioned seeing Jaquavia pacing outside the house shortly before the gunshots rang out. None of this aligned with his claim of a sudden, unprovoked home invasion. As detectives pieced together the timeline, the evidence painted a damning picture. The crime scene had been manipulated in ways that suggested an attempt to stage the murders. Furniture had been overturned too deliberately, and the position of the bodies seemed orchestrated to support Jaquavia's version of events. But the details didn't hold up under scrutiny. The breaking point came when forensic analysis uncovered blood spatter patterns inconsistent with Jaquavia's story. The trajectory of the gunshots and the placement of the wounds indicated the shooter had been standing close to both victims, an act far too calculated to match the chaotic narrative of an armed break-in. With each revelation, Jaquavia's web of lies unraveled further. 2 days after the murders, Jaquavia was brought in for questioning. He maintained his innocence, clinging to his story with a mix of desperation and defiance. But the mounting evidence was impossible to ignore. When confronted with the gunshot residue on his hands and the inconsistencies in his timeline, his composure cracked. He became defensive, stumbling over his words as detectives pressed harder. The arrest came swiftly. Jaquavia Jackson was charged with the murders of his wife Shakeema and her brother Levoy. The community, once admiring of the Jackson family, was left reeling in shock and disbelief. News of the crime spread quickly, with neighbors struggling to reconcile the image of the charming, devoted husband with the cold-blooded killer the evidence now suggested he was. As Jaquavia was led out of his home in handcuffs, Cameron was placed in the care of family friends, his innocence a stark contrast to the dark reality surrounding him. The boy's quiet tears mirrored the grief of a community forever scarred by a betrayal that no one had seen coming. This case took a shocking turn, but justice is far from served. Stick around by smashing that like button and sharing this story to spread awareness. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutor approached the jury box, carrying an air of determination that filled the room. Over the past weeks, the evidence had spoken volumes, but this moment the summation was the chance to drive home the depth of betrayal and destruction caused by Jaquavia Jackson. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor began, their voice steady, measured. What you've seen here is a story of deception, a man willing to do anything to keep his secrets from being exposed. A man who let fear of the truth drive him to unthinkable actions. The prosecutor gestured toward the exhibits, the text messages, financial records, and forensic analyses that had meticulously unraveled Jaquavia's alibi. The prosecution argued that the motive was simple yet chilling. Jaquavia had been living 2 lives, balancing his marriage to Shakeema with a hidden family and financial obligations that were growing impossible to sustain. The paternity hearing had threatened to expose everything, and instead of confronting his choices, he had taken matters into his own hands with devastating consequences. Witness after witness had stepped forward to share the impact of Shakeema and Levoy's deaths. Shakeema's colleagues described her as a beacon of strength and integrity, a woman who embodied the values of service and compassion. Levoy's friends spoke of his unwavering loyalty and the joy he brought to every room he entered. Each testimony was another reminder of what had been lost, leaving the jury visibly moved. The defense attempted to counter the narrative, but their arguments lacked weight. They suggested that the crime scene evidence was circumstantial and that Jaquavia's behavior was consistent with a grieving husband, not a murderer. But their reasoning faltered in the face of hard facts: gunshot residue on Jaquavia's hands, the strategically overturned furniture, and the lack of any credible sign of forced entry painted a damning picture. The most striking moment came when the prosecutor played the 911 call from the neighbor who had heard the gunshots. The recording captured muffled voices followed by chilling silence, a sequence that seemed to underline the personal nature of the crime. Jaquavia, seated at the defendant's table, lowered his gaze, his previously confident demeanor now subdued. When the jury returned, the courtroom was tense, every breath held. The foreperson stood, the verdict in hand. As the charges were read, guilty of malice murder, guilty of aggravated assault, guilty of every count, murmurs rippled through the room. Shakeema's family wept quietly, their grief a mixture of sorrow and relief. Jaquavia showed little reaction, his face impassive as the judge addressed him directly. "Your actions were deliberate and callous," the judge said, their tone firm but not unkind. "You have shattered lives, not just those of your victims, but of a son who will grow up with questions no child should ever have to ask." Outside the courthouse, the mood was somber yet reflective. The tragedy had left an indelible mark on Covington, a reminder of how quickly trust could be broken. Vigils were held in honor of Shakeema and Levoy, their faces smiling back from framed photographs as friends and family shared memories. The stories told weren't about their deaths, but their lives, the joy they brought, the people they inspired, the legacies they left behind. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the town, the Jackson home stood quiet, its windows dark. For the community, this house would always symbolize a lesson, a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the irreversible cost of deception. What lessons can we learn from this heartbreaking story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-life stories like this, hit subscribe and join our growing community.